The Steady State Sentinels, produced by the Steady State, a community of former national security professionals who spent their careers safeguarding the United States, at home and abroad.
Today, we continue that mission by staying true to our oaths to defend the Constitution,
uphold our democracy,
and protect our nation's security. Join our expert hosts as they interview field-tested guests whose unique experiences shed light on the crises and challenges facing our nation.
welcome to the Steady State Sentinel. I'm Lauren Anderson. I think it's fair to start with something most people will agree with. Our immigration system is broken, and it's been broken for a long time. What's harder and more important to talk about is what happens in the meantime, while people are still living their lives inside that broken system, especially when rules change midstream and the predictability breaks down. In recent weeks and months, we've seen pauses and slowdowns in asylum processing and related work authorization. On paper, that just sounds technical. In real life, it means people who are here legally, who have been vetted, and who follow the rules suddenly can't work, they can't plan, and they can't support themselves or their families. Delay becomes denial in practice, even if no one ever says the word no. But this isn't just about immigrants. When systems shift from being rule-bound to feeling discretionary, immigrants, their neighbors, employers trying to comply, and those charged with enforcing the law all feel the strain. That's the space we're going to be in today. Not politics, but process, legitimacy, and the human consequences when stability disappears. This matters because immigration is where we see in real time whether our institutions and the leaders who run them are keeping their promises to us, and what happens when they don't. The lessons don't stay contained in one policy area. They shape how people relate to government, to employers, to each other, and to the idea that following the rules protects us. I'm joined today by Amy Peck. Amy has spent more than 3 decades practicing immigration law, representing individuals, families, and businesses, and working directly with and often negotiating with agencies like the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the State Department. In addition to her legal practice, she serves on the Board of Trustees of the American Immigration Council and has long been involved in pro bono asylum work, giving her a perspective that spans policy, enforcement, compliance, and lived human impact. And after that rather serious opening, Amy, I've given a little of your background, but I would love for you to share what drove you to become involved in immigration and labor law, and why have you chosen to stay in it for more than 3 decades?
Hello, Lauren. That is a great question. And I would like to say when I started out as a young attorney, I was as clueless as anybody and just trying all sorts of different kinds of law. And one of the partners at the firm that I was working with gave me a pro bono asylum case. And he basically was like, yeah, do the best you can. Don't tell anybody you're doing this because it's not a very career-worthy case. And just do your best. And I took that case and I won it, and I was hooked on immigration. I felt like I was having a direct impact to this individual. I felt good about what I was working on, and I never looked back. It was not that cool to be an immigration lawyer in the 80s and 90s. I'm sure it's cool now. It's probably still not cool, but I
That's awesome, and it so impresses me that that's something we share. Actually, is we've had a passion for what we do, and we're not driven solely by financial remuneration or anything else, any of those external sorts of things that reinforce people. It comes much more from within, and it sounds like that's what you're saying as well.
Absolutely. It's something that at the end of my career, I'll look back and I'll feel good about what I've done. I've helped families, I've helped businesses, individuals, and I feel like what I do has value. It's important work. So yeah, I feel that I'm contributing.
Well, thanks for that. And thanks for sharing a little bit of your own story. And I think you'd agree that one of the biggest concerns we Americans share is a lack of trust in our government, in our leaders, and in each other. And I think we conflate people with their functions, and that makes trust even harder to build. And you and I met about a decade ago, and I'm just going to let it kind of trail off with three dots at that point and let you run with that.
Lauren's teeing up a story. Well, to put it bluntly, I did not like Lauren when I met her, even though I didn't know her. Lauren was introduced to me as a former FBI agent and leader, and I decided immediately that I did not like her. And I assumed we shared no values, and that as a career law enforcement officer, we would have nothing in common. And so I gave her the cold shoulder, and I might have even been rude, and I apologize for that. Uh, but my distrust of the FBI really came from some experiences that I had after 9/11. And, I'd like to explain. I think we all remember where we were when we learned our country was under attack on 9/11. I know exactly where I was. I was dropping my kids off at the sitter's house, and the TV was on, and they were Russian immigrants. And we stood in stunned silence as we watched those planes hit the Twin Towers. And I remember crying with them. I remember being shocked. I remember the profound sense of loss and vulnerability. And I was practicing immigration law at the time. I remember feeling dread that the immigrants, all immigrants were going to be blamed, even though it was just a few bad people who were involved. But I remember the whole country kind of pulling together. And as a lawyer, I was in agreement that we should have stronger systems and, that there were some failures by the agencies that needed to change. But what happened and why I didn't like Lauren when I met her, even though I didn't know her, was that I had a number of Muslim clients, and the FBI started putting surveillance on Muslim places of worship and kind of harassing my Muslim clients with really no basis other than the fact that they were Muslim. And I, went head to head with them. And there are some other parts of that story, which I'm not going to go into, but it really eroded my trust in the government because they were coming after my people, my clients who didn't do anything wrong. So back to Lauren, even though I didn't like her, Lauren persisted, which if you know anything about Lauren, she is very persistent. And after a while, I really came to understand that I was wrong to dislike her based on what she did for a living. And I really think about that, Lauren, a lot. When I find myself rushing to judge someone that I don't know well, and I remember that I didn't like you and you're an awesome person, and, that I was wrong. And so, I will also say it cuts both ways. These days when I'm out meeting new people and I say I'm an immigration lawyer, I know they don't like me sometimes either.
No, that's absolutely fair. And that's real for what's going on in a lot of parts of the country.
Yep. So anyway, I really think about how we met. And when I'm rushing to judge somebody based on what they do, I really try to step back. I'm human. I'm not always perfect at it, but I do my best.
Well, as I say to people, the day I'm perfect is the day I'm dead. So
That's right.
I think we can look at it that way. And I think too that our history matters because it really helps explain what's happening right now and why trust, once it's eroded, is so hard to rebuild. And you and I were speaking recently and kind of moving into some of the things happening now. And I shared with you that I have a young woman, Afghan, who I'm mentoring, who was on the last flight out of about 100 girls and young women out of Afghanistan in August of 21. And she had an interview, obviously, I'm not going to say where, in the last week to get her green card because everything else has been satisfied. And they said, well, thanks for coming in, but your green card is on hold indefinitely. And it's created such a sense of anxiety for her. She's been doing everything by the book, checking in whenever she was asked, following all the rules. She is permitted to work. And now she's had this setback. And so I'm curious, what are you seeing right now with individuals, families, and employers that you work with?
There's definitely an erosion of the rule of law. And I say that and I understand not everybody knows what the rule of law is. And so let me give sort of an example. When you are watching football, which this time of year everybody's watching football, there are clear rules around the game of football. Everyone knows, the players know, and if you're watching, you know that if you get the ball into the end zone, it's a touchdown and it's 6 points. And then after that, you get an extra point. So this is like the rule of law. The rules are transparent, they're accessible, so everyone knows what they are. And they're supposed to be equally enforced against both teams and independently judged, by the refs and umpires. And then you get instant replay if you don't like something that happens, right? It's like due process. Like, hey, this person really was down on the 5, and they didn't really make it into end zone. So everybody knows what the rules are. But imagine if during that football game, all of a sudden the refs started saying, well, I'm going to give you 6 points if you cross the 20. And I'm only going to do that for some people. And the other team, you have to get into the end zone. That's similar to the erosion of the rule of law. And for immigrants and immigration, we're seeing erosion of the rule of law because there is so much chaos and upheaval around what's happening. And, we don't always know from day to day what's going to happen, what the administration, the White House is going to say or do. We don't know what the rules are. A lot of the policies are being taken down from the websites. A lot of the things that we've relied upon for years and years as guidance are being taken away as resources. And so now it's sort of like, guess what we're thinking? That is an erosion of the rule of law, and it's terrifying. In my career, I've never seen it at this level.
Wow. That's saying quite a lot, given your multiple decades and given what happened after 9/11. And you and I have talked about that a little bit, about how some of the things that were put in place and some of the rights that were suspended were necessary for a brief period of time. But you're saying that you've never seen anything like that. And that's stark. That is really stark. And it's hard. I mean, if we feel this way, imagine the person who's trying to do things the right way, not even speaking about those who have not followed the appropriate path. And there are plenty of those, but it makes it extremely difficult. And I think kind of what you're getting to is that we're talking about discretion versus arbitrariness. And, every system that we're in, and certainly every legal system, I think you would agree, requires discretion, human judgment applied to individual circumstances, but still in the context of the law. But to me, it seems like there's a bright line between discretion and arbitrariness. And when people can't predict what compliance looks like, then how can they have any trust in the system? And how can we who aren't even in the system have trust in it? And how can we support those who might be in our lives in one way or another that are in the midst of this. So for you, why do you feel predictability is so critical to a legal system? And, what happens when the rules are no longer protecting people, but they seem to be very arbitrary, to use that word again, and going back to even your football analogy, how do you distinguish between necessary discretion and the kind of arbitrariness that we're beginning to see across the spectrum?
Boy, we're still figuring this out day to day. But I will say it's very stressful for everybody, for businesses, for individuals, for families, because you don't know from day to day what the rules are going to be. So again, back to this idea of rule of law, the rule of law, which we like to feel that we are part of a country that is founded on rule of law. And then think about the football where the game is changing mid-game. And that's what's happening in immigration. So from day to day, individuals may not understand if they're going to have the ability to work or not, based on rules that are being very quickly rolled out. There's a category called H-1Bs, and on Friday at 5 p.m., a month or so ago, it was in September, the Trump administration rolled out a rule that said basically you have to pay $100,000 if you want to sponsor a new H-1B. And it's effective the following Monday. Now, I was on vacation that weekend and my phone started to blow up. And everybody's trying to understand, what does this mean? The announcement was very poorly worded. Clients are, overseas, and they're like, do we have to come back? And so they're scrambling around trying to get on flights to get back into the US because we thought maybe if they were here, the 100,000 didn't apply. Well, then over the weekend, the Trump administration tweeted different things, posted different things, and everything conflicted. And at the end of the day, litigation ensues. And we're trying to figure out still to this day what exactly it means. But it was utter chaos around this particular visa category. And if you change, if you look at different visa categories around temporary protected status or asylum, the rules keep changing very quickly. And from one day to the next, we're not sure what is going to be, prioritized, what we're going to see when we walk into maybe an asylum interview or things like that. So it's, as a lawyer who my career has been trying to advise on what the law is, despite what people think. Lawyers are trying to uphold the law and advise on the law. But when you don't have the basis for the rule of law to advise on, that everything starts breaking down: the trust in the systems, the trust in the lawyers, because people think, well, don't you know what you're doing? Well, I'd like to think I do. But if the rules are clear to me, then it becomes chaos and arbitrary decision making, which is not what our country is about. But that's sort of where we're headed.
So I think, building on that too, one of the things I find interesting and always have about your practice, Amy, is that you have worked, whether it's pro bono or paid work in the context of your law firm. You have worked with individuals, to groups, to organizations, to corporations, and obviously we're going to respect privacy, but corporations whose names our listeners would recognize. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how that ripple effect might be different in each of those categories. And when we were speaking recently, you mentioned a particular client who was an entrepreneur, business owner. I think you said he owned a restaurant. So I'm curious if you could comment on what you're seeing in each of those groups that you work with.
Yeah. So fascinating. When you talk to people about their understanding of immigration, and it seems very abstract until something happens to them. And through my career, I would get multiple calls, usually one a week to this day, from somebody who will say, they usually start off establishing their values. Oh, I don't like illegal immigration. Thank you, But my guy who works for me is great, and I'd like him legalized. And, I've heard that if I had $1 for every time I heard that, honestly, I'd buy you a casita in France.
I'm signing up. Let's collect those dollars so I can get a casita in France.
But it's fascinating that people feel the need to establish that they are, law enforcement minded, but by George, when it comes to their guy, they're a good guy. Well, this story that I told you was my client received what's called an I-9 audit. And so I-9s are the form everyone fills out when they go to work. They establish who you are and that you can work. And then the government audits those. And in the course of the audit, if they find out that people are not working lawfully, they make you fire those people. Well, this client had 3 Mexican restaurants, and 2 of them received audits. And at the end of the day, these employees had been working for him for 15, 20 years. He had to fire 30 employees and shut down one of his restaurants. And he called me in tears because he didn't know, I would like to say, he did not know that these individuals were not lawfully working. And he had appropriate paperwork for them, but they were borrowing identities from their families or various, one of them had a Social Security card that just didn't exist, but it looked real. So things like that happened. But he called me in tears and he said, what am I going to do? I can't find people to work, in the kitchen. These were fantastic employees. And he said, how could this happen? And I said, well, the Trump administration promised to do more I-9 audits. They did the first time under the first administration. It's within their legal right to, do more I-9 audits. And he said, these are good people. I don't understand why the Trump administration is going after these people when they are good people. I thought the Trump administration was only going to go after criminals. And I will tell you, I had a moment where I heard it and I said, what the Trump administration said was that immigrants are criminals. So they equated undocumented people with criminality, which is not what the law is. The law says that if you're undocumented, that's a civil violation and you can get deported. Okay. But you're not a criminal under state law. Like you haven't assaulted somebody, you haven't murdered anybody, you haven't, been a tax cheat or anything like that. And he didn't understand that. He thought that the administration was only targeting criminals, when in fact the administration, to me, was always very clear that if you're undocumented or even in a status that we don't like, we're gonna send you back to your home country. So and the Trump administration is doing exactly what they said they'd do.
Oh, and did he share with you who he had voted for by chance?
He voted for Mr. Trump and wished that he could take his vote back because of what personally happened to him. And I think, and of course they lost their business. So I found it fascinating,
And it's horrible because I think that one story encapsulates, as does the situation with the young Afghan woman. These are real people and real consequences who are doing the right thing, who are following the rules, who have done what everyone has asked of them. And while I think we can all agree that people who are breaking laws, committing violent acts, hurting people, they need to go. I think you and I would be in complete agreement on that.
Absolutely.
But when we talk about people like your client and this other young woman, that's not fair. That's not what I understand our country to be about. That's not what I understand our democracy to be about, or our respect for the rule of law. To me, that flies in the face of it. I don't know how you feel about that.
I sympathize with people. We uh, we have to do something about our immigration laws so we don't have this continuous problem with people in an undocumented status who can't legalize. And I will say that is ultimately what the issue is. We have over decades, starting even before the Reagan era, every administration has sort of turned a semi-blind eye to people coming into the U.S. who are working in an undocumented status, and our laws then trap you here. You can't leave once you're here because the ways the laws are set up. Because once you leave, you can't return ever, maybe, or maybe after 10 years if you're lucky. So it traps you here. Well, that's a dumb law. Let's change the law. But Congress has failed. Democrats have failed. Republicans have failed. They have both failed to deal with the problem. And so now we do have this issue with people who are here in an undocumented status. And I think it's indefensible mostly to Congress. Like, stop being babies and do something about these laws, and do something that makes sense. You know, the dreamers that came, they can't even fix that, right? The people who came as young kids. And I'm going to say one other thing as long as I'm on a roll.
Go for it.
The Trump administration is doing something that makes no sense to me. They are so focused on quotas and metrics that this idea that if you are here in an undocumented status, or even in a status that they don't like, that we are going to get rid of you. And they have quotas. So this quota is supposed to be met by Immigration Customs Enforcement, either daily or weekly. A certain number of people need to be arrested and deported. Every other administration until now has had law enforcement priorities. And Lauren, you're a law enforcement person. Law enforcement does not have unlimited resources. You don't have the resources to go after everybody, right? Usually it's
absolutely not. Yeah, you have to prioritize what you're going to do based on what your mission is and what's the greatest risk in terms of people's security.
Yeah, let's target pedophiles. Let's target traffickers. Let's target, drug gangs. But this administration says we are targeting a number. We're quotas, which is why we are seeing indiscriminate arrests. They go into public, they're pulling people off the street. Why? Because they're trying to hit a number. So when you have no law enforcement priorities, then everyone is a priority. And that creates unstable systems and quite frankly, a law enforcement, I would say a problem, right? Because if you are a real criminal, you're going to have the resources to hide, right?
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
You know that, Lauren.
Oh, I know that. I know that. Absolutely. And another thing going to what you're talking about is the limited resources. And as you know, they've been pulling very large percentages, ranging from 25 to 45% of FBI agents are being pulled off national security matters, cyber matters, white collar crime to go out and arrest people with ICE. And going to one of the things that you mentioned in terms of stats, just in the last few days, another statistical requirement came out. and the administration has decreed that they are to search for 200 people a month to denaturalize. These are people who are already American citizens who have gone through the process, been naturalized. And I believe the number I saw that over the last 8 years, it was only 125 people denaturalized, and they want to get 200 denaturalized per month.
So that's another example of a quota. I hadn't heard that, and thank you. And now that is astounding. A number that is arbitrary. Like, why? So what law enforcement's going to do, because the number is the target, is start sort of indiscriminately pulling these cases. And if anything is, I don't know, like if they have to hit the number, they're okay. Let me give you an example. It just popped into my head. Think of a factory production line. And you have two factories, one where you have a quota of 2,000 widgets a day, and one where there's no quota. It's like build the best product you can.
Right.
Which one are you going to buy? And which one is the one where they're going to, cut costs and say, oh, that one fell on the floor and is damaged. I don't care. Right. Like when you have a quota as a goal, you're going to cut corners, you're going to do things that you wouldn't normally otherwise do because you're trying to save your job and not get fired and meet the quota. So I think it's not good law enforcement. I think it's not good policy, and it's quite frankly shocking because they're humans, at the end of the paper, these are human beings. So
I agree. And one of the things we've talked about, and I think this tees it up perfectly, my mouth is twisting, is the human cost inside the systems. And you've just spoken of that. And, I recently heard from a young FBI agent, I say young in terms of tenure in the Bureau, who reached out in a very, very discreet manner because of deep concerns they have about where the FBI is going. But what was perhaps even more interesting and also heartening in its own kind of perverse way is that this agent shared that the sense of low morale, which is rampant in the FBI, the constant changing of priorities. We're going to reorganize again. Oh, wait, no, last week we were going to reorganize and now we're going to focus on this and not do that. And this agent shared that her counterparts in other agencies, including ICE, were saying that they felt demoralized, that they were upset with how things were going, and they don't themselves like the way the enforcement operations are rolling out. And that speaks volumes.
Too, we're seeing the people I've established relationships with on the other side, right, in ICE, USCIS are not all, of course. There are some people who are very rah-rah and like this, but most of the career people are deeply unhappy and ultimately are not aligned with this sort of extreme, the extreme views and the extreme measures being taken. And, the career ICE people are really kind of up in arms because they are, again, not all, but the ones who I think have been around long enough to see this job through multiple administrations don't feel that they are effectively doing their job when the goal is just to pick up anybody who looks like an immigrant and throw them, in jail. Like, one of the goals is to fill the detention centers. That's a goal, right? We're all paying for that. Detention centers are being built and reopened at the cost of millions and millions of dollars a year. And, to me, it's like, well, if you're going to deport them, why do you have to detain them for all this time? But that's, they want to fill the detention centers too. My guess is, I don't want to start a conspiracy theory here, but my guess is there are private contracts at play.
Oh, Yep. Somebody's going to be making copious amounts of money on this, and that's unfortunately on the lives and the well-being of a lot of people, some of whom deserve to be in detention,
Yes, yes.
and many of whom don't. And you mentioned the fact that you've seen this through multiple administrations, and we talked about some of the aftermath of 9/11. And when you look at everything that's happening today, and we've touched on this a little bit, but from a broader sense, what warning signs are you seeing? What things are you seeing that trouble you deeply, if there are any? And do you have ongoing and long range concerns based on that?
Well, I do. I was thinking back about 9/11 and how even though it was such a deeply, deeply troubling event and it involved people who were foreign born, right? Which hit my heart, right?
Hmm.
But the American people pulled together. I remember feeling a love and connection to my fellow Americans during that time, you
Hmm.
know, and feeling like the flag was a symbol of um, togetherness of everybody in this country, and I felt like we really pulled together in a way after 9/11 that was very beautiful. And again, with some of the things that happened afterwards, I didn't agree with, but in that moment, we had a president who said some very I think things that brought the people together. Now we have a president who purposely divides us. It pits us against each other. And say what you want, and this is not a political um, broadcast, but we do objectively have a president who is pitting us against each other, even in his Christmas message, which I found very distressing. I want to be uplifted by a Christmas message, but it was very divisive. And so it's harder to find common ground. And this is what I find troubling because there's so much demonizing of immigration. And I had somebody once say to me, oh, recently, oh, you're an immigration lawyer. So illegal immigration. I'm like, why did you assume illegal immigration
Right.
when I said the word immigration? Well, aren't they all illegal? No, they are not. You know,
Wow.
so we really demonized, this beautiful thing that our country is founded on. And we most of us can trace back our families only 2 or 3 generations, some more, but the first lady's an immigrant. So it's very troubling to me.
Yeah, I agree with you. I am on one side of my family. I am a second generation. My grandparents immigrated, and I'm sure it's true for most of the people who will be listening to this. And I'm so glad that you're sounding those positive notes too, and about how we know we both feel the same way, how deeply we love this country and the people we live alongside and the friends that we have. And we've talked about a lot of the things that are not going so well and that can be better. And I would like for everybody who's listening to us to get some thoughts from you, because I think the average person, despite those things that kind of fly out of people's mouths, I think the average person wants to like who's living next door to them and wants to see themselves succeed, their family succeed, and the people they know succeed. So kind of considering that, is there one thing that you would ask that people notice or do differently in this context going forward? I want to have some positivity. I want some ideas. They can be conceptual, they can be concrete, but I'd love to know what you think each of us can do to improve this situation going forward.
I have a couple ideas here. So, and I have to start with the story that Lauren, it's going to start this way. I was in a dive bar a couple weeks ago, of course. And I was listening to a bluegrass band. And a man next to me struck up a conversation, and I'm just trying to enjoy the band, right? But he's like, "What do you do?" And I'm like, "Oh, do I go there?" And I'm like, "Okay, why not?" And I said, "Well, I'm an immigration lawyer." And he immediately said, "How can you justify being around those criminals? They none of them pay taxes, and they're taking my job." And you know what? I squared my shoulders and I looked him in the eye and I said, "You know what? Those undocumented people probably pay more taxes than our billionaires do. They pay property tax, they pay sales tax, most have withholdings taken out, Medicare and Social Security that they will never collect. And by the way, sir, everything you think you know about immigration is a lie." And I really thought I was going to get punched.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I'd have been ducking at that point, Amy.
But I was like, I'd had it, right? Like, listen, I'm just here listening to a band, and he asked me the question. So I'm just challenging people to challenge their own assumptions, right? Like, learn more. And the moral of my story is, you can't learn about this from the news, either left or right, right? You can't learn from it either of the news sources. You have to do some research, go to credible sources. The American Immigration Council has really good research articles if you want to learn something. Or ask an immigration lawyer, ask me. And the second, so do your research and assume everything you know is wrong.
Always a good place to start. It's wrong.
Well, I do that, anymore when I walk into a situation that I don't know much about. I'll be like, you know what? I can't really trust, the media, either side anymore. So I just try to go in with an open mind. And then just let's start demanding that Congress actually do their job and stop being absolute whips about doing immigration reform. Like, it's ridiculous that they have not tried to update the rules in 30 years. It's ridiculous. So
It is.
so those are and we need to stop being manipulated by the rhetoric. That's the last thing. When you start hearing rhetoric that demonizes immigrants, just step back and say, who's manipulating me and why? So those are the things that I would suggest right offhand.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. And thank you so much, Amy, for joining me today and for your honesty about what you're seeing. I know this is going to leave our listeners with a lot to think about. And I'm grateful, Amy, for all you and your colleagues do every day. And we're a better nation for your work. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you, our listeners, for joining us. This is Lauren Anderson for the Steady State Sentinel, Still Standing Watch. Thank you for listening to the Steady State Sentinel podcast. Don't miss out on more insights and exposés from America's premier global security experts.
Also, subscribe to our Substack at substack.com/@steadystate1 and follow our social media. And join us right here next week for another exciting edition.
The Steady State is a nonprofit organization working to sustain our democracy and national security.
Join us and support our mission by visiting www.thesteadystate.org.